Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScript Podcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. We hope that you're doing well and enjoying this spring. We've got a great new episode for you here. We hope you enjoy it. And if you would like to support the podcast by giving monthly, you can do so on onscript.study/donate. Or you could give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. We'd appreciate that. If you haven't done it yet, just take a few minutes to do it. It would help us out. And otherwise, thanks for listening. Enjoy. Our guest today is Dr. Brent Strawn, who is D. Moody Smith Distinguished Professor of Old Testament and Law at Duke Divinity and Duke University. He's the author of several books, including The Old Testament is Dying, Honest to God Preaching, which I hope to have as a future episode on OnScript, The Old Testament, A Concise Introduction, Lies My Preacher Told Me, and the book we're discussing today, The Incomparable God, Readings in Biblical Theology. Also, and I hasten to add that he hosts a podcast called In Parallel, which is an offshoot of OnScript that looks at resonances between biblical and modern poetry. So be sure to check that out if you haven't already. It's a short run series. We did 6 episodes and we plan to do more as well. So Brent, welcome back for your 4th OnScript episode, or 10th if you count the In Parallel episodes.
Oh, thank you, Matt. Good to be back. It's a true honor to be back for the 4th time. I don't know if we mentioned that it is my 4th time, but I'm really appreciative to be back. And again, I think that I'm behind that one guest we all look up to. Yeah, Professor Shablatzim. I'm behind him, but I'm fine with that. I'm not really worthy to open his Greek New Testament, really. If he has one, I don't know if he has one, but if he did, I don't think I'd be worthy of opening it.
He doesn't have one, but he can look it up online. So he doesn't need one.
Yes, Blue Letter Bible, something like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, good to have you back, Brent. Hope you're doing well. Thank you for this book, The Incomparable God, Readings in Biblical Theology, and it's a bit different kind of book. So maybe you just want to talk about the process by which this book even came about. What's the backstory here?
Well, the backstory is that it really owes. I owe everything in the book owes so much to the editors, Colin Cornell, who I know has been on the show recently with you, talking about his first love, Elephantini, and also Justin Walker, 2 of my former students at Emory, and I hope you'll have occasion to have Justin on at some point. His new book that's coming out is Remarkable Treatment of Violence and Lamentations and Neo-Syrian Art. So Justin and Colin, honored their old professor by kind of getting their heads together and saying they wanted to put a collection together for me of some of my pieces. And so it's 18 essays that they've sort of curated and selected. 12 of them have been published before, 6 of them are new. And I just sort of gave them access through Dropbox to all my stuff, and they looked through it and picked their favorites. A couple things they wanted to include I had designated for elsewhere, and then as I say, I wrote about 6 new pieces for it. 3 of those were fresh compositions of essays, and 3 were talks or sermons I've given before, and so we're in various stages of completion. And Justin and Colin wrote a really thoughtful introduction to the work. They were the ones who came up with the title. And what they saw was a kind of thread through some of my work, or maybe all of my work, that I confess I hadn't fully seen before. And that's where the Incomparable God title came from. So much owed to Justin and Colin, and I'm thankful to them. Big shout out to them.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. It's a fabulous collection. And I think some of the best biblical theology happening right now, and just really thoughtful series of essays. I enjoyed reading them. I was telling a colleague, in fact, who was asking me what I was reading, I said I'm reading this collection of essays, and it's just pure gold all the way through. So, I've read some of your essays before, but a lot of these I hadn't. So I appreciated that. And interesting to have someone else look in on your work and find those common themes that run through, because you're not someone who has stuck in, say, one book your whole career and said, I'm going to just be a Leviticus scholar for life. Most scholars don't do that per se, but a lot of them do get tons of mileage out of one book that they work in.
That's right.
So
I was tempted. I was tempted to really settle in on Obadiah. I mean, there's so much there. I was thinking about it, but I decided, after I gave it, approximately half my career, I thought, no, I should move out to something like Joel,
exactly.
Or, Malachi.
So you've stuck kind of hung out around Psalms and Deuteronomy. I mean, would those two, would you say, in terms of places in the Old Testament, be the places where you've done the most scholarly work? Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. Pentateuch and poetry more broadly, I think, is kind of how I self-describe. But I admit that I've dabbled around a good bit, and that's been fun for me. It's also kind of exhausting at times, right? Because if you dabble into another section, you got to try to get up to speed a little bit, or a lot of it, and you don't want to appear like a dilettante, But I find moving around exciting and life-giving, and I think if I were to be sort of just in one sort of field my whole career, I probably find myself a bit bored with that after a while. So I think it's partly a function of that kind of wanting to stay interested and lively about things. And I do think there's some cross-fertilization that happens, that I think back over my career and the early days that I spent as a graduate student working on the Princeton Seminary Dead Sea Scrolls project, for instance, really kind of formed certain habits of mind in me that continue to pay, I think, dividends. And so, even things that you don't continue to work on extensively, I dabble in the scrolls here and there now and then, but I'm not a real Dead Sea Scroll scholar. There's real people like that, And so that's still helpful, though. I think it's fruitful. The analogical questions and evidence and assessment of them it's been really fruitful for me, and is not so far in my career, held me back from promotions or tenure or whatever. And so that's been a joy for me.
Yeah. Is that something you had to, I don't know, make peace with, that you do have a wide range of interests? Because I think some of us in the field, we look around us and maybe we have a certain image of what a scholar ought to look like. Or have you always felt like, no, this is who I am, kind of coming right in, and not something you had to discover per se, but you just knew from the beginning that you're a wide-ranging kind of scholar? Well,
maybe a bit of both. I mean, I have this funny story that you'll appreciate because it took place at Emory, and I had my two senior colleagues there when I taught there, and I was in my third year review. And so my two reviewers, internal faculty members, were Carol Newsom and Luke Johnson. I mean, and it doesn't get any better than those people, right? And they're reviewing me at my third year there as an assistant professor. And I'd published a number of things, decent number, I think, for a third year assistant professor. And so they sat down with me and they said, yes, well, you've published a number of things. They seem a bit disparate. So we kind of wanted to know what motivates your writing. And I was kind of having this out-of-body experience, right? Because here I am with Luke and Carol, who I looked up to, and these, demigods in biblical scholarship. And I was thinking, man, these people aren't as smart as I thought they were. because I'll tell you what motivates my writing: getting my name in print, so I have sufficient number of publications to get tenure, so I can continue to feed my family. That's what motivates my writing, And I just, of course, I didn't say any of that. Mm-hmm. This was an out-of-body experience. I said, At which point, then Luke jumped in and said, well, what motivates my writing is experience. I'm interested in Christian experience. And then Carol jumped in and said, what motivates my writing is rhetoric. All of my writing comes back to rhetoric. And I thought, this is fascinating. And I thought it's also intriguing, right? Because they're at a certain stage in their career, full professors, chairs and everything. And they're looking back a little bit and they're probably, hindsight's 2020. And here I am at my third year review and I'm just trying to make sure that I keep my job. But I think that in retrospect, I do have, certain things that kind of have marked my publication record, and Colin and Justin's flagging of the incomparability of God is one of those things. And they start with a comment about my wide-ranging work or ranginess or something like that they call it. And it was, they speak of it appreciatively, and that was meaningful to me. And so I do think it is kind of making peace with that and my restlessness in some areas. But I am conscious, to answer your question fully, I'm conscious of how I could I could be a lot better in certain areas if I just stood still and dug in even deeper.
Yeah, I don't see it that way. I really appreciate that in your work, that you'll do a collaborative project with your brother on psychology and the Bible, and then you've got depth in ancient Near Eastern studies and poetry, narrative, contemporary poetry. I think that adds to the depth because you do it well. So let's get into some of the content of the book. You have an essay early on talking about ways that the entire book of Genesis develops the idea of imaging God, as well as its limits. So it's easy to confine the idea of the image of God to Genesis 1-9 because those are the only places it really appears. But you take it further. So what are some of the ways that Genesis is potentially developing the idea of image of God, and what benefit do we have by looking at the entire book as opposed to just those first chapters?
Yeah. So this has kind of been an interesting question for me. This is now my third essay, I think, on the imago, and still don't think I got it right. But I was in the first two really impressed with Richard Middleton's work, which I think is fantastic on the image of God. And it was sometime after that Richard Briggs wrote his essay on the image of God, and it's something like and other things Genesis does not make clear. And I thought that was such a clever title, and so it captured my eye, and I read it. And a lot of what I do in this particular essay is building off of Briggs, and he thinks that as important as Middleton's work is, at the end of the day, it is sort of an extra textual explanation of the imago because it's so embedded in the discussion of what the image might mean in the ancient Near East, which is something I explored in those other two essays and which I think is quite important. But, if we, the textual evidence is so limited, of course, it is limited to those first 9 chapters. But if we want a imminent interpretation of the imago, then maybe we shouldn't overprivileged extra biblical data. And so what Briggs thinks is that maybe this is kind of a hermeneutical lens through which we read the rest of the Old Testament, that the imago is actually an anthropological question. And in my essay, I try to further that a little bit by talking about the image of God as a verb or as an ethic, not as a noun or an essence. In fact, I've come to really be attentive to and bothered by the extensive discussion in so many Christian circles of us being humans as quote unquote image bearers or throwing that language around. Because I think in the history of interpretation, what the image is hardly clear and has been the subject of a million different interpretations. So to throw it around as if it means something to say we are image bearers, I don't know what that means. We got to kind of first explore what the image is. And if you look at this in Genesis, I think there's 2 ways to go about it. One, of course, is what is God's own image in Genesis? How is God figured? And God's figured in a number of ways. And that's one of the pieces of this essay. Incomparable in a way, right? Multiple ways. And also preeminently in the first chapters, nonviolently. And so if you kind of combine that stuff, Briggs's question and all these other data points, then you can start tracing how the anthropoi, how the human figures image or do not image the deity in what follows. Cain, violent, not imaging the deity, not imaging the nonviolent deity, and so on and so forth. You get some ups, you get some downs, you get a lot of downs, you get a few ups. But then you get at the end of the book, you get Joseph, who I think is kind of the climax of the book, obviously in terms of the structure of Genesis, but also in terms of this question of the imago.
Yeah, so it strikes me as you're saying that it's very interesting how there's almost okay. So let's say that we go with this idea that Imago Dei is underdetermined in Genesis 1, and let's also give the writer credit that that's on purpose in some way. That it's a question or a quest that we're given at the beginning. It's interesting that as you turn to Exodus, that you get another strategic ambiguity with Yahweh, with the revelation of the divine name. So these really fundamental questions: what is a human, and then who is Yahweh, are strategically underdetermined in Genesis and Exodus. And so,
I like that.
Like what?
That's good.
What are these? Is that a kind of wide? Do you think that kind of thing might be a wider strategy across Scripture? Do you see? I was talking with one of my former professors, Gary Schnickler, recently about this. We recorded a podcast and talking about like ways that like some fundamental events in the Old Testament are like really ambiguous, and that there's something important about that as a rhetorical device or narrative strategy. So what do you think on that front?
Well, I mean, inspired in part by what Colin and Justin identified as a kind of a theme in this, and also building on another piece that really would have fit this collection nicely, but is slated for another one. I think that the sort of on the move, moving target nature of God is a way that the Old Testament, the way Israel keeps itself from fixating over much on just one thing, which could easily become an idol. I mean, it's in some ways it's related to the second commandment, if you number them that way. But I think it's also really related to the incomparability formula. To whom can you liken me, says the Lord, And so God is sort of always moving. And in this other essay, I have a footnote, and it's Genesis to Judith Wolfe, who pointed out to me after hearing this paper I gave that C.S. Lewis has a similar kind of discussion of these angelic figures in the Space Trilogy, where they look like golden rods of light, and that's only because they try so hard not to move. They're moving so fast. They have to try to stop moving, and they look like shimmering gold rods. But they can manifest to the human eye, but they do it through these a million different kaleidoscopic images. And in the second novel, Perelandra, one of these angels does this to the human protagonist, and he can't even take it in. It's just overwhelming, the quickness of the different images, flashing, bear, human, whatever. And I think that that's something of what's going on with the presentation of God in the Old Testament, that in its variation, it is affirming certain things about God, and at the same time, seriously curtailing and containing the human propensity to fixate on just one. So whether we really like an image of God or whether we really hate an image of God, it really doesn't matter, because it's not standing still for very long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could imagine a kind of tension there between like a God who wants to be known and understood and near, but then on the other hand, not contained, not reduced, not pinned down.
Yeah, and then of course that's you find not only human metaphorizing of the deity, you have God's own self-metaphorizing. I am like a bear to Ephraim, a lion to Judah, so that you have God's own sort of revelation that is both is and is not in terms of the metaphorical presentation. So I think that's part of what's going on in the Imago stuff. And I think what's intriguing about Joseph at the end is that, he kind of goes from not a great example, little snot-nosed, brother who's, tattletaling on his big brothers and stuff, and overly egotistical, etc., to someone who has all the power and could pay back as significantly, definitively as he wants. I mean, he could single-handedly end the promises to Israel, and he acts nonviolently, and that's sort of in the ultimate kind of image of God, of the nonviolent God there, as a move towards forgiveness and provision. I will provide for your little ones. Do not fear. The brothers speak to him as if he's God, right? They use that particle of entreaty that's used only in prayers to God. And Joseph's attuned. He says, am I God? I'm not God, but I image God. I image God. I am an image of God. And so I read the Joseph story with fresh eyes. And it was also then for me not a small thing to think about why so many early Christian writers thought about Joseph as a type of Christ.
Yeah. And I think in that essay you refer to Gary Anderson's reading there of a kind of pattern in his life of all the way down into the pit and this sort of symbol of death and then coming up out as well. So there's a lot more, and it just kind of sparks all kinds of ideas, thinking about, whether in its undetermined qualities, there's an importance to the mystery of the human person as well, that the Bible's wanting to resist over defining in Genesis 1. We've got the incomparable God, but also the mystery of the person that... Yeah.
I like that. I've been thinking about this a little bit. I don't know much yet. It's one of these dabbling things I'd like to think a little bit more about. But I do know that there's increased attention to the multiplicity of the self in a positive way in psychological discussions. The braided self is how some people talk about it. You kind of inhabit different roles and therefore different selves. And, I'm a son, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a friend, I'm a professor, whatever. And that these are complementary. There's not always on the same page. They might have different nuances or whatever. And I've thought about that with reference to not the Old Testament more generally, but particularly with Ecclesiastes and his contradictions. I've thought about that. If this is sort of a hint towards the multiple self that is feels different ways at different times, inhabiting different questions and different roles.
Yeah, good. So if we move on to this, thinking about this incomparable God. I'm a little self-conscious now. I don't know which to go with.
I'm having tomato soup after this for lunch.
All right.
It sounds more British or something.
Tomato. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you make a case for Yahweh's super abundant benevolence, which is a great phrase. Looking at Exodus 34, 6 and 7, and another key moment in the revelation of who God is that at some level is defining of God, but also contains its own mysteries, to be sure, right? So Exodus 34, 6 and 7, the passage, where Yahweh passes by Moses on the mountain, the Lord, a God, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, all of that. And it has the judgment clauses at the end. Yet not letting the guilty go unpunished, punishing to the third and fourth generations. So I'd be curious to ask you why, at the end of the day, you see this as revealing a God who is super abundantly benevolent. You say he is ultimately not simply or predominantly benevolent, but super abundantly, if not almost exclusively benevolent. So how do you come to that view, given the judgment stuff in there, which, at one level you might think like these are two sort of warring qualities in Yahweh? That's one way to read it, right?
Yeah, and that's how I've often read it or heard it explained, though I've always heard it explained as well by my Professor Pat Miller of blessed memory, that if we do read that way, we have to read it that the two poles are unequal, and definitively so. I mean, third, fourth generation punishment, but thousands of showing the steadfast love. So this essay emerged from, and that conclusion emerged from a close poetic analysis of this unit, which emerged from a class I taught at Emory way back when on the Bible and poetry. And my teaching assistant that year was Katie Heffelfinger, who's now at the Irish Theological Institute, and wrote a great dissertation on Second Isaiah, which I've also depend on in this essay. And also we had a poet in residence named Melissa Range, who's gone on to quite a good poetic career and teaching career. So we're really blessed with a great teaching team. And by that, I mean those two. And the students liked them better, no doubt, than me. But I was kind of taken with that unit, which I thought was intriguing. And I was taken with the question, one of the questions we were dealing with, which is kind of the meaning of a line meaning versus sentence meaning, and all that jazz. And this kind of remembered this text that I had read, this statement I had read in Dale Bruner's commentary on Matthew years ago in the Lord's Prayer, where he said, he tried to make the case that in heaven, on earth as in heaven, applied not to just the third imperative, but all of the first three imperatives, and that the lineation sort of can be read that way, and that
so like hallowed be your name, also on earth as in
heaven.
Okay, yeah.
Thy will be thy kingdom come on earth as in heaven. Thy will be done on earth as in heaven. So that it kind of applies all back, and started making me thinking about gapping and all that jazz in Hebrew parallelism. And so in this essay, I do a kind of rather exhaustive or exhausting maybe analysis of the poetry. And I do think that some of these things are doing double duty. And so that the way God shows steadfast love is in part by not leaving wrongdoing unpunished, and that the forgiveness of iniquity, transgression, and sin applies to the children, even the grandchildren, to the third and even the fourth generation. So I make a case that there's these pieces of the poetry are actually doing double duty, and readers will have to read it more closely to see if that's the case, if they agree. But if it is the case, then what you have is just this it's not even close anymore. It's because even the punishment is now a sign of benevolence. And the forgiveness is also goes back to the third and fourth generation who are slated for punishment. So that, I think, is helped me see what was going on in that unit. That unit is so strange, and here's where Katie Heffelfinger's monograph on Second Isaiah was helpful to me, because her argument in Second Isaiah is that what is presented there in the poetry is this presence of God, this speaking presence of God, which is what the exiles most need to hear. And they need to believe that God is with them, cares for them, etc. But there's been damage done. So God has to admit that, and also God has to admit how they are speaking about God, and what they think about God. So there's both kind of tensiveness in tone, a kind of judgment tone, and then forgiveness and tone, until the sequence is resolved, she thinks, in Isaiah 54, and in that unbelievable statement about God never being mad again. Yeah. And I think that's actually what's going on in Exodus 34 too, is that God has to sort of acknowledge, yes, this is part of who I am. I punish for wrongdoing, and that's what happened in the golden calf. But what is and I have to acknowledge that, like, the damage has been done. The scars go both ways. This fundamental breach of Israel's breaking of the covenant and the commandments at the mountain, and also God's acknowledgement of the aftermath. But what Israel really needs to go forward is not just to acknowledge, not just to remember that their God will and can punish them, but also that God can and will forgive, and is mostly, almost entirely inclined to do so, and that's what will enable God to ultimately move forward with them, and them to move forward with God. So I think all that's kind of captured in that poetry in a dense, even if at times ambiguous way, because that whole unit is somewhat ambiguous. I mean, Yahweh seems slow to go until this revelation is given.
Yeah, such a rich text. I think Exodus 34, 6 and 7 and the surrounding territory is kind of analogous to Genesis 1 in the sense that it's one of those texts where the more you go back over it, it just keeps yielding. So I really appreciated that careful poetic analysis. When you were talking about gapping and the idea that, sometimes a poetic line will assume, say, information from a previous line or a verb or noun or something like that. It made me think, too, how Psalm 136 describes the, Yahweh striking down the firstborn of Egypt as a manifestation of chesed, of his steadfast love enduring forever.
Yeah.
So there you don't have like these warring poles of, on the one hand, God sometimes going to come in judgment, and then on the other hand, sometimes in mercy. But actually, that in that case, at least, the judgment on Egypt as a manifestation of chesed, love.
That's right. Of course, that raises issues about violence or social location and
absolutely
and understand. But I think that is far more emic, and that's something I take up in other essays in the book. Far more emic than sometimes maybe our more quick to judge etic kind of assessment of these things.
And just for listeners, like emic is sort of an insider take, like how did Israel themselves, the writers, view God, experience God, as opposed to our second order questions about that arrangement.
Etic, that's right. Yes, emic and etic, very important. It's not as good as tomato, but it's close. It's not British. Yeah.
So let's move on to Deuteronomy. As I mentioned, you've hung out there a fair bit, and it's taken a beating in some quarters that prize nuance and complexity. The messiness of it all. And then you come to Deuteronomy and things can feel, at least on the surface, very black and white. We're confronted with life and death decisions. What are some ways that maybe you'd want to commend Deuteronomy's rhetoric to us, or at least help us understand what the book is doing by speaking so starkly?
Yeah. I think it's a great question to kind of think about more broadly, too, because I think if we could talk about our cultural moment, if we could categorize it, and I don't know if we can, our cultural moments are pluriform in many, but I think that most people are probably, kind of put off by the clarity of Deuteronomic or covenantal kind of rhetoric. If you really start thinking about what we watch on TV or stream or whatever, it's far more complicated than that. And so I think that most people, even religiously faithful people, are probably more akin to think like Job and Ecclesiastes are probably right. And then it's a Deuteronomy, you got to look at it with a bit of a askance, scowl or something. But so much of the Bible lives with Deuteronomy. I mean, Deuteronomy just leaves its imprint. I think it's Gordon McConville calls it the juggernaut of the Old Testament, that he says, wherever you go in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy is somehow there. Even if people are resisting it, it's there. So it's such an important book to think about. And, in terms of, I think it is more nuanced than people tend to think. And of course, everything is. I mean, and, one of the things I hope emerges from this book is that my own habits, or what I would like to believe my own habits are about these issues, about complicated issues in Scripture, especially things that people don't like. And oftentimes they're things I don't like. Those are places where you have to sort of roll up your sleeves and work harder. That you have to, get after it. Is this actually how it is? Or does a fine, granular assessment demonstrate otherwise? It's so easy to treat these things quickly, but that just won't do. And the problem, of course, is our own sort of cultural moment prizes quick hit discourse rather than long form, granular analysis. And yet, our society also cannot function without that long form, careful analysis, whether it's in medicine or law. And if it's there, then we have to do it. You have to do it in theology too, I think, and in Scripture. So for me, I started thinking about this, and again, the complexity of the covenantal stuff. I think for me, the person who's most helpful was Dennis Olson and his work, especially on the Moab covenant in 29:1 and following. But there's 2 essays in the book on Deuteronomy, and one I try to get into the issue of why is it so repetitive? Why is the rhetoric so repetitive? And is that just sort of stupid, simple-minded, whatever? And I was helped by a study of repetition in film and literature by a scholar named Bruce Cowan. I don't know how I came across that book, but I do think it's related to
with your ranginess that leads you into those places, right?
Well, I think it is related to that because I think it found it so helpful. Like it was like suddenly I could understand Deuteronomy's rhetoric in a better way thanks to Bruce Cowan, who doesn't talk about Deuteronomy but mummy movies and all sorts of interesting things. And he says there's 3 kind of typology of repetition. One is kind of destructive repetition. That's Freud's, kind of the repetition impulse or whatever. And then the emphasis, that's the second. Then the third kind is transcendence, he says, where, you repeat things. And if you repeat them, it's almost like you can occasionally, not every time, like not even realize where you're at in time because you've repeated it and you're suddenly transcendent. You're transcending time, at least for a moment. And I suddenly saw a whole lot of things about Deuteronomy's rhetoric of repetition. And so I thought I could dispense with the destructive rhetoric, really demonstrate quite easily the emphatic nature of Deuteronomic rhetoric, that it is, focused on key verbs like keep, observe, do, and in certain grammatical constructions, which suggest how careful that is to be done. And then the objects of those verbs, statutes, laws, judgments, etc., commandments, and then the time frame, which is now, today, here. And suddenly I thought, man, this is not only emphasis, but there's something happening within Deuteronomy itself with all this emphasis that actually makes of the reader or listener exactly what Deuteronomy wants when you're done. When you're done with the book, you are someone who has been transformed into someone obsessed with these words because you know which ones to keep and you now know how important they are. And if you know how important they are, then you're going to go back and reread them again. And so that was really helpful, Cowan's analysis to me to think about Deuteronomy's rhetoric.
I think for those of us in teaching, one of the markers of a student undergoing a change in their thinking is that they begin to speak in a new way. And I like the idea of, coming out of the tail end of Deuteronomy and you're kind of given a language that's learnable, that you've been practicing repeating already if you've read the book. And so it facilitates a kind of transformation of the reader. And that kind of leads into another dynamic you talk about, which is inscription. What does this idea of inscription mean? You're not talking about like carvings in a stela or something like that, but
no, but that's cool, isn't it? That stuff is really cool. I'm talking about inscription as the way that pieces of literature write us into them
as readers, right? So
as readers, yeah. And I mean, some people talk about it just as readers. You're put into a subject position vis-a-vis the literature. But in Deuteronomy, the rhetoric of Moses in that book is clearly writing this second generation into the events at Sinai, which they may or may not have been alive for, according to the biblical chronology, right? The biblical timeline. They were 20 or younger, and some of them conceivably have been babies. And so they weren't the ones who committed the wrongdoing with the calf, but they're spoken to as if they were. And the famous line in 5:3, not with our ancestors did God cut this covenant, but with us, those of us here alive today. Well, sort of, but like also not, because all those people that were there that were cutting the covenant are now dead, according to the Numbers material, right? So Moses really inscribes the current community into the former community's storyline. And not only does he do that, then he instructs the next generation to do that with their next generation in chapter 6. When the children ask about the laws, Moses says, well, you tell them the story about the laws. Don't tell them the laws, tell them the story about the laws. And so he's basically making every parent into a little Moses, writing their children into the story. And so inscription, I think, is functioning in multiple levels there in the book, and is a really effective rhetorical move to involve the listener, involve the reader, so that I can't hold it at a distance anymore, because it's not just about them, it's about me. Even though chronologically it's kind of not about me, but wait, no, it is. It is about me after all. Yeah.
Good. All right, we're gonna do like a super fast speed round. 2 questions. First one, what is black and white and red all over, but it's not a newspaper?
Black and white and red all over, but not a. I thought I had this one, man. No, you're too smart.
This is from my daughter.
Okay, I'm not as smart as your daughter, clearly.
From Lucy to you, that's an embarrassed zebra. All right.
Nice. I agree. Yeah. I agree. Kudos. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she wins the speed round.
Oh, she loves jokes, and in fact, all the fantastic jokes that have been part of this show have probably half of them are from her.
Nice.
So, what do you think is the best book in biblical studies in the last, say, pick a random number, 52 years?
Thank you for this. The listeners might want to know that I asked for this question. I think this is my 4th time on the show, but I've never been asked this question. And I've heard many people asked, of course, being a super fan. So I really wanted you, Matt, to ask me this. And all I can say in response is, Matt, I'm offended. I can't believe you asked me that question. I can't answer that question. I take offense at that I could pick one. Oh, no, I'm just joking. Okay, I will say one.
Yeah.
Actually, I thought about this really, and seriously, I did think about it. And of course, many great books have been mentioned. I thought about it in terms of what books do I have 2 copies of? I used to live a long way from my office. So I had a small select number of books that were double copies, where I had one at home and one at my office. And so I don't know, maybe I have about 6 or 7 of those. Maybe
okay.
There's a few more, but I can think of a couple of them off the top of my head. I have 2 copies of Cross's Canaanite Myth and Hebrew Epic. I kind of grew up in that kind of school.
Yeah.
I have 2 copies of Child's Introduction to Old Testament of Scripture. I have 2 copies of Hayes and Pressner's History of Old Testament Theology. I have 2 copies of the Women's Bible Commentary. And I have 2 copies of, and this is actually one that I know has not been mentioned on the show, I think, but I actually think one could make a case for it being a very important book.
Drum roll.
Maybe not the most, but here it is, 2 copies of Otmar Kael's Symbolism of the Biblical World. And that's something that I dabble in a little bit with the iconography. And Kael's book, 1972, so we're really at 51 years, right? Was translated into English in 78. So we're within the 50-year. That really inaugurated a subfield and changed a whole bunch of attitudes towards Israelite religion, towards the study of the Psalms, and towards meaning making in non-textual ways. And Otmar's still alive and still chugging, and he just has a number of students there in Switzerland and beyond. I think that's a very, very important book and deserves to be included in a small handful of kind of field-changing books. And again, not as popular as some of these others, maybe because it's a bit technical about the art and stuff, but it is a remarkable, stunning achievement that he wrote that, I think, when he was 32 or something. And the command of the Psalms that he has alone, let alone that, coupled with the command of the Near Eastern art, is stunning. So I wanted to lift up Kael's book. That's the one I really want.
Yeah, very good. And for listeners trying to Google that's Othmar Keel. That's how you would spell it. So Otmar Kael, but it's Othmar Keel. So Symbolism of the Biblical World. That's a great recommendation, and I think you've
Thank you.
made a good
I'm
case.
still offended you asked the question. I'm still offended.
It's good. It's good to be offended.
I'm offended at myself because I asked you to ask me the question. And I'm offended.
We live in an age of offense, so it's all too fitting.
We're conflicted selves.
So from the sublime to the mundane, let's talk now about what's going on with Elisha. He curses some boys in God's name. They come out, or bears come out and maul them. Some people would think that's a bit excessive, perhaps.
Perhaps.
For this guy, although, as you point out, making fun of people who are follically challenged is no small thing.
That's you're speaking my language. You're speaking truth to my life.
So, your title of the book is The Incomparable God. In what way does this story, if you could read this story and think this highlights the incomparably disproportionate qualities of divine so-called justice. So what do you make of this story?
Yeah, so this is one of those tricky texts where, like I said before, I think you got to roll up your sleeves and get into it. And I've kind of joked around about this text for years because I am follically challenged. And so this is something close to a life verse for me. It hasn't yet displaced Leviticus 13:40 though, Matt, which of course, as you recall, says, if a man loses his hair, he is bald, but he is clean. To which I say, the word of the Lord, thanks be to God. So Leviticus 13:40, thank you for whomever put that in there.
He's got a tattoo on his head.
I should do that. That's a tattoo, Leviticus 13:40. Oh, so anyway, so I've joked around about this, don't mess with the bald people, etc. But what I have to admit, I was dissatisfied when I started reading about it. And again, it emerged from teaching experiences and thinking about those. And also it emerged, frankly, from an independent study that Colin and Justin and I did together with another one of their classmates, Justin Pancook. And we were doing a theology of the Old Testament, or theology of Scripture, independent study, and we decided to mess around a little bit with Lectio Divina and Magrassi's amazing book called Praying the Bible. And it's a really thoughtful, deep book, short book, but very deep. It's not cheesy. It's not like, this is how you do Lectio Divina. Go into a dark room, light some incense, think peaceful thoughts, breathe deeply. It's not that. He's very thoughtful, kind of overview of the tradition and the stages in Lectio and all that. And we did a Lectio. I kind of picked two texts, somewhat on random, not exactly, but one was from the New Testament, and this was from the Old Testament. And we did that, and then we came and reported back to each other what we found. And it was fascinating, the kind of overlaps. There was just differences as well, but how the Lectio process produced a different kind of sensibility about that text that was less concerned with the violence of the text and more wondering if we were these youths that deserved judgment somehow. And that kind of put me onto some thinking and whatever. And so I started reading, and I got very dissatisfied with the secondary literature, which I thought was cavalier about the great ambiguity of the text and its finer exegetical points. And which then devolved into a kind of superior attitude towards the text and a superior attitude towards Elisha, where you can find in the secondary literature that he's sort of a newbie to ministry. He's going to learn better. He's like in his first church. And, people do in their first church, they sometimes,
lose their temper,
kill 42 youths. It was accidental. But, by the time they end their career, they've learned, and it just seemed so dissatisfying to me. And of course, there's no definitive sense of this because the text is vague, but the text has enough in there to really problematize that Elisha intended them to die, that God is even directly the one that sends the bears. That could be said, but it's not said. And so the text is spare, the text is underdetermined. And, in some ways, it's just all these details are strange. That Elisha's already passed the children. He has to turn and look at them. And why are they calling him baldy? And why is he bald? There's all sorts of possibilities for that, including that he's in mourning for his master, or that he's bald because he is a prophet. He's taken some sort of vow. All of which suggests that when the boys make fun of him or call him baldy, it may not be just that he's follically challenged, but maybe there's some sort of treating his mourning lightly, treating his master's death or departure lightly, treating his prophetic task lightly, and that he's on his way to Bethel, right, the house of God and beyond. So just a really remarkable text. I think I gave this as a paper in Walter Moberly's one of his seminars at Durham, and I think he's the one who said, "My inner organ is twitching right now about this text." I mean, I just want to do something figural with it.
Right.
And for me, it wasn't so much figural as much as it was Lectio Divina. So looking at all those exegetical details, which Magrassi says are crucial for a proper Lectio Divina, they're not at odds with exegesis. It's just more than exegesis. And he actually says the wonderful line is, exegesis is not technique, it's mysticism. So at the end of that essay, I offer my own Lectio experience of that text. And I just think it produces a completely different assessment of what's going on with Elisha, what's going on with these youths that mock him, and what's going on with God, who is really absent from the text, only mentioned by name by Elisha. So that doesn't fully answer your question, but if I could do a footnote to it, I would say, I think that one of the things that the Old Testament, including its really difficult parts, you could say it's true for the New Testament as well. One of the things I think it does is it shows, again, the incomparable nature of God, but that God is just sort of, you just can't contain God. And so the language that I often hear about, whether in church or in my classroom sometimes, about, well, God doesn't work that way, whatever way it is. I'm pretty sure that the biblical God says, I'm not sure you have any idea or any right to say how I will or do not behave or work. I reserve pride of place to do as I wish. That's not a satisfying answer in every way. And in other ways, it's a fully satisfying answer in every way.
So you're highlighting maybe a hermeneutical dynamic in your work, which is, tell me if this sounds right, like going to those sites of difficulty and re-examining, slowing down, walking through the details, and soaking in the complexity and allowing that to kind of transform our experience, not to move toward a sort of definitive solution to a problem per se, but it's also, Eugene Peterson might have been in your book. I can't remember where it was quoted. I just read recently where he talks about like exegesis as an act of love and that slowing down and careful attention. Is that from your book?
I don't know, but I did quote Peterson in that essay, I think, but I don't know if it's to that point.
And then on the other side, so that's the exegetical or hermeneutical tendency, and then on the other side, the freedom of God. Would you say those are two like kind of themes in your work that you want to come back to?
Yeah, and again, I didn't see some of this as clearly until I read Colin and Justin's introduction, and I thought, oh yeah, I haven't really talked about the incomparability formula extensively or anything like that, except in this one essay that's not in this book. But I do see how there's a kind of push towards that. And I have to say, I grew up in the Wesleyan tradition, which is not like known for its, sovereignty of God sort of thing, more on free agency and problem of evil being the result of human decision making and stuff like that. But then I went off to a Reformed seminary and learned some important things about Christianity and Christian theology that I didn't know growing up as I did. And I think the sovereignty of God, the freedom of God is one of those things. Of course, it's not just a matter of Reformed theology or Wesleyan theology. I mean, as a biblical scholar, I think it's a matter of reading the texts and reading them closely. But I do think that this is one of the stunning things about Scripture. And, some of my heroes have talked about this extensively. I mean, ultimately Brueggemann, that the freedom of God, the sovereignty of God, the elusiveness of God, the inability for anyone to sort of manage God is so important. And the constant tendency, or in Brueggemann's language, the temptation to domesticate the text and to domesticate the God of the text is above all the church's temptation. And the just the wildness of the deity. And I've grown in light of the Near Eastern stuff that I read and work in a little bit, to think that these really wild, even sometimes violent presentations of the gods in the ancient world were in some ways purely indexes of their divinity, that they were just otherworldly, unnatural entities that are not to be trifled with. And so less a problem of morality than actually testimony to their divinity. Now that's the different mindset than what we're used to. We don't like violence. Well, yeah. Of course we do like violence. We watch it all the time. We stream it. We play games with it and so forth. So we adore violence. So it's not that we don't like violence, but we just sort of try to pretend it doesn't exist here and there and whatever. So I think that that's really an important point, and I think you've identified it rightly.
Yeah. There's a lot more I'd love to cover, including you have a really intriguing essay on the ways that the Canaanites in Joshua are and are not like orcs, but I know we're at the end of our time, so I'm going to leave that to readers to dig into. Many more essays.
Tolkien's orcs, yeah,
for sure. So, Brent, thank you so much for taking the time to discuss your wonderful book. I highly recommend this to people interested in sort of the front lines of biblical theology. So it's called The Old Testament. It's called The Incomparable God, Readings in Biblical Theology. And shout out to Colin Cornell and Justin Walker for editing that. Thanks so much, Brent.
Oh, thanks for having me again. It was great to be on Script. Super fan here and forever, Matt. So thanks again.
All right, take care.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.